Guys, before we get started, let me put a disclaimer right here. This ranking is by no means an indicator of the quality of these watches in any way. I'm also aware that a lot of people no longer want to hear about value retention and all that, but it is by far the most asked question on my channel or in my Instagram DMs. Like, is this watch going to retain its value, or am I losing money with this? And truth be told, it was and still is one of the main questions I'm asking myself before buying a watch, because like so many others, I'm not interested in, unnecessarily burning my saved up money. So that's why I thought, why not create this sort of tier list in which we sort watches into 5 categories, starting from increasing in value to stable or slightly increasing to tending to lose value up to decreasing value. I also want to mention that the starting point for this list is going to be the current market price. So the price one would have to pay when buying it from a grey market dealer, eBay, or just from a private seller. For watches like the Rolex Daytona, the market price can be well above the retail, but for the most part, like the Tag Heuers or Breitling, for example, the market price will be slightly below retail. And for those of you who are wondering about how I check or, fix the market prices for this video, I recommend doing a quick Google search on the exact model and go onto all sorts of marketplaces and dealer websites to look for the top 10 or 20 offers, and then deduct about 5%, and you'll have a good estimate on what the watches go for in terms of market price. All watches shown in this video today are rated on how long it would take you to find a buyer for your offer and how much that buyer would be willing to pay. And at this point, I would like to thank my friend and grey market dealer Max for helping me out with this video. He's taken over his dad's shop and they have been selling watches for a couple of decades now, so he's my #1 go-to source when I want to know whether something is a good deal or not. So thank you, Max. Hello, this is Jenny editing this video, and just a little disclaimer, because I've noticed something whilst editing the video. I realize that this is a very Central European point of view on this topic, but I would say that it isn't much of a difference in other parts of the world. But if you have a different experience or a different point of view, let me know in the comments down below, and we can all hear about your side of the story and what you think about it. And now that this is out of the way, I think we can continue with the video. Category number 1, increasing in value or holding its value. For this category, I want to look for watches that increased in value of about -5 to +25% or more after buying it at market price, or better, watches you can immediately sell for the current market price because demand is so high that finding a buyer won't be a problem. So basically watches that professional sellers love to purchase right away without burning a lot of money. For Rolex, mostly around 10 to 20% below market price, but you'll pretty much get your money back the next day. To no surprise, most Rolex watches are within this category, even the full gold, platinum, or iced out watches, except for the majority of the ladies' watches. All of these watches are in high demand and oftentimes immediately increase in value by a couple of percentage points after buying it. What's really representative of Rolex watches is the fact that you will be able to find a buyer almost always, so you wouldn't have to wait more than, I want to say, like 1 to 2 weeks before you will find someone willing to pay the current market price for your Rolex. We can also add AP's Royal Oak in 41, 39 and 37mm to that category. And since AP has terminated their relationship with ADs by the end of 2021, so this year, which means AP will no longer sell through ADs, only through their own boutiques, I would for once very cautiously say that it will only get worse with AP, or better, however you think about it, in 2022. Given the switch. And lastly, I'm also going to throw in Patek Philippe's Nautilus and Aquanaut watches, as well as very few Omega models like the Snoopy, for example, as those are very high in demand and sought after by collectors too. But that is pretty much it for this category of watches that are super easy and quick to resell due to their very high demand. Next up, and for category number 2, we are looking at the holding value or slightly increasing in value type of watches. All watches in this category are those which you will be easily able to sell within a year for a -10 to +10% margin if you bought it at market price. It would also include those watches you would be able to sell to a grey market dealer for a comparably good price too. Here's where the Rolex ladies watches come into play. Ladies watches, they aren't super hot, but you should be able to sell them within like 4 weeks or so if you wish to. We also have a couple of watches from Rolex's partner company Tudor in here. The Black Bay 58 is a good example of that. You will be able to find someone who would like to buy it really quickly, and same goes for the Black Bay GMT or the newly released Black Bay chronograph, especially for the Pendadal version of this. So if you would like to reinvest that money into a new watch, you should be able to easily sell these within a couple of weeks. There are also some Omega watches that fall into this category. The most popular here is the Omega Speedmaster Moonwatch Professional, as well as the Seamaster Daiwa 300M. I would also like to add some more expensive watches like the Odysseus from A. Lange & Söhne or the Moser Streamliner here. Those two watches aren't super quick to sell, but quite rare and still very popular. So the demand and supply kind of meet in the middle here. There's also a Vacheron Constantins Overseas or the Royal Oak chronographs and offshores from AP that I would consider to be in this category too. And the last group of watches in this category are basically most of the complicated watches from Patek Philippe. Whilst they're not as easily sold in the time they are still available at Patek Philippe, they're also always going to be discontinued sooner or later, and from experience they always rise up in value, which creates more demand obviously, but keep in mind that could take, I don't know, like 10 to 20 years sometimes, so be aware of that. All right, so let's move on to category number 3, the watches out there that remain pretty much at their market price. All watches in this category are those which you could sell within a year for about, I want to say like a negative 15 to plus 5%, given you have bought them at market price. And you also wouldn't be running into problems if you would like to sell them to a grey market dealer either. And so this category is for most of the watches from all the major luxury watch brands you can think of. Given that, and here comes the very important part, again, you have bought them at their market price. And so here are a couple of examples. There's Breitling's Navitimer or the Chronomat chronograph, Tag Heuer's Aquaracer, basically all steel models from Nomos, Oris, Sinn, Omega, Hublot, Panerai, jaeger-lecoultre, IWC, Schaffhausen, and Zenit, etc. But all the regular stainless steel models and not the precious metals or highly complicated ones. This also goes for the Tudor watches I haven't yet mentioned, or most of the other watches from A. Lange & Söhne, which are more expensive, yes, but still very popular amongst collectors. And especially when it comes to those watches below, I want to say like 3,000, where sellers do not have a big margin and therefore don't give too much of a discount, is where you find watches that largely retain their value, like Tutima or Junghans, for example. And so let's continue with category number 4, watches that tend to lose value. Watches in this category are those that are very likely going to see a decrease in value of about like 0 to 25% if you would sell them within a year. And there are mainly the following two, I would say like large group of watches that belong in here. Firstly, we have the two-tone, so steel and precious metals, and full precious metal watches from manufacturers like I've just mentioned, Hublot, Panerai, Omega, Breitling, jaeger-lecoultre, and so on. There isn't a high demand for these watches, so therefore you would have to bring some patience if you want to sell your watch, which often leads to lowering your initial price before you can find someone who's interested in it. Group 2 in this category are those complicated watches I have talked about in category 3. So for example, a perpetual calendar from JLC, or most of the Defy watches from Zenith, or the complicated Hublots. It simply gets increasingly difficult to find buyers for these watches. What is also important for this category to mention is the fact that this is also more difficult to find a professional seller who is willing to buy the watch from you, given that these watches tend to, lay around for a bit before anyone comes in who wants to buy it. Those sellers, would rather not have their money be held in these watches and either, directly decline such deals or offer much less than their perceived market value, like a good 30 or 40% less even. And so for the last category number 5, we are taking a look at those watches that would lose or drastically decrease in value. They're those watches you see a decrease of at least 25% if you were to sell it within a year after buying them at the market price, if not more. But let me tell you that ironically, those are the same watches with an incredible amount of detail, manual finishing or complexity. So really high grade watches, but that exactly is the problem here. The market or demand for these types of watches is comparably really small, and there are not a lot of people, out there wanting to buy these watches. It would be, this like pie chart of that one circle being very rich people and the other circle being extreme watch enthusiasts, and that little overlap would be those who would buy watches like that. And again, it is also why grey market dealers aren't overly interested in them if there's not a very, specific request from another customer to source a certain watch. So they would either, just not buy it from you or offer you much less, perhaps even less than 50% of what you have paid for it. And again, let me give you some examples of what I mean here. It affects all those very highly complicated or niche watch brands, and perhaps some of you might not heard of those brands and hearing them for the first time today. So you've got Moser, for example, Ulysse Nardin, or watches from Girard-Perregaux, F.P. Journe, Breguet, or Frédéric Constant, as well as some of the highly complicated from Vacheron Constantin, except for the overseas. And so here we have it, a ranking of watches in terms of their ability to retain value. But there are three main things you should definitely be aware of. First, there's always an exception, and sometimes you either get lucky or unlucky. And some watches at a certain time might sell better or worse than you would expect, but this ranking should give you a broad overview of what's currently going on and what you can expect. Secondly, I do not expect any major changes in the near future, but there's obviously no guarantee for that. I mean, you cannot say what's going to happen with Rolex watches, for example, if we experience an extraordinarily heavy economic crisis soon. So I think it is safe to say that you would be best advised to never loan money for a watch or buy it with money you don't really have. And lastly, I want to mention I have not included all watch brands. I think we would have to sit here for a lot longer if I had, but you could say that watches within, a similar price category mostly perform similar too. And so yeah, that's it, I would say. And I would like to repeat myself here. This is by no means indicative of a watch's quality or how good or bad something is. I also want to refrain from judging anyone on how they choose to spend their money and what the motivation behind it is. I know that understanding and getting behind the dynamics of watch prices can be really confusing and frustrating, especially when first getting into it. So I hope I could help you understand the market a bit better with this video. And so if you have enjoyed this video, you can give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. It really helps me out. And if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!